it's Mena. Welcome back to my channel, or if this is the very first video you're seeing of me, then welcome to my channel. Sorry about that. Welcome to my channel. Please do hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't already. I post Monday through Saturday, and today in this video I'm going to do my top 10 best knitting tips. Now this is just in case, I thought this would be a fun video to do because there's some people that are new to knitting, and if you're brand new to knitting, then here are some great tips to do and stuff like that. So these are just the personal tips that I came up with when I first learned how to knit and knit over the years. Again, I've been knitting since I was a teenager, but here are some tips that I've learned over the years when you're knitting that are great and very helpful. And if I missed, and these are my basic personal tips, but if you guys have any tips that I literally missed out, put them down in the comments below of what your personal knitting tips are. So I'm going to get started. So number one on my list would have to be pay attention to the recommended needle size for your yarn. So when you buy your yarn, so here's an example. When you buy your yarn, it will have, oh, this one doesn't have it. Let me see if I can find this, here, this one, your yarn. On the label right around here, it'll say which label of yarn is recommended. So right here, this one recommends an 8 size for knitting needles. And it talks about because that's like, okay, so anyway, so sorry. So when you knit, and you have yarn, look at the label to see what size needle your yarn recommends, because if you knit with big skinny yarn with big needles, it's going to be too tight, or if you knit bulky yarn with big needles, it's going to be way too tight either way. So no matter like what type of yarn you're using, it's important to pay attention to what needle size is recommended for your yarn, because then it's either not so tight or it doesn't look baggy or anything, and it looks much better. Number 2 on my list would have to be count your stitches after every row. So this is one basic thing I know a lot of people have a hard time with. So sometimes people will accidentally drop a stitch when they're not paying attention. But the important thing is when you are knitting, it's always good to count your stitches after every row to make sure you don't drop a stitch, because if you drop a stitch when you're knitting, then if you have fewer stitches from when you first started, then you must have dropped a stitch. Or if you have more stitches than you must have than you started with, then you accidentally increased when you weren't supposed to. So that's the important part, is to count your stitches after pretty much every row. I know it takes quite a long time, but it's just the important thing, because then you can basically know how many stitches you started with, and then make sure that you have the same amount of stitches that you started with, unless you're supposed to increase. And if you do end up with more stitches than you started with, then unravel it and go back to see what happened. And if you have fewer stitches than when you started with, then then check to see if you dropped a stitch. So that's like one of my best tips. Number 3 on my list would have to be use a row counter or tally marks to keep track of your rows. So with knitting, it is pretty easy to count your rows, like you just count the ridges, so then you don't have to keep going back and forth counting the ridges. I suggest probably you take a piece of paper and a pencil and then make tally marks and stuff like that. Because the tally marks seem to really come in handy for when you're keeping track of rows. And I used to actually do that when I first started knitting, because it was just really easy for me to keep track of my rows and stuff like that. And then my aunt and uncle for Christmas one year got me this row counter, and this is actually a very special gift, because this was the last present I got from my aunt and uncle together. Because my uncle passed away in 2014 of brain cancer. So they got me this row counter for Christmas because they know I love to knit, and they thought it would be easy for me to keep track of my rows. So I use this all the time when I'm knitting, because it helps me keep track of my rows. But if I'm doing 100, I get a piece of paper and put down 100, so then I know I'm on row 100, because this thing only goes up to 99. So yeah, so if you need a way to keep track of your rows in knitting, knitting, because sometimes it is pretty easy to get lost in knitting. Just use a row counter or just a tally mark and a piece of papers, because that's what I started with. Number 4 on my list would have to be, in case you use a row counter, use a piece of paper if you go up to 100. Because 100, again, this, like I just said, this thing only goes up to 99. And so if you get a piece of paper and a pen and write down 100, then you'll know you're on your 100th row and stuff. And then after you finish up to 100, because this thing only goes up to 0. So let me show you how this works. You can just click the top, and then it goes up to 1. So then it counts your rows for you, so then you don't have to go back and forth and count them yourself. It saves a lot of time, and it's a lot quicker and easier. But because this thing only goes up to 99, I suggest write down 100, so then you know which 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, or whatever 100 you're on, to keep track of which 100 you're on. Because again, this thing only goes up to 99. Number 5 on my list would have to be, pay close attention to your pattern. So this is one thing I know a lot of people probably have trouble with. I mean, sometimes I have trouble with it. The important thing is to pay close attention to what you're supposed to do. Like if it says you're supposed to knit so many certain stitches, blah blah blah. Like if you're supposed to knit a certain amount of stitches, like let's say you're supposed to knit 10 stitches, purl 10 stitches. Again, you count your stitches. Just to make sure you're doing it right and stuff for your pattern. So the important thing to pay close attention to the pattern so then it comes out right. I've had problems where I wasn't really paying attention to my pattern, and some of my projects ended up really terrible and stuff like that. Like I remember I made a Hermione Granger beanie, which I'll get for you guys right now. I made a Hermione Granger beanie, and I accidentally knitted it with worsted weight yarn, and I accidentally did it 5 times when I was only supposed to do it 4 times altogether, because I got confused because I thought it said 4 more times. Because if it says more, then you're supposed to do it that amount. More, but if it says total, you're supposed to... Okay, so let me explain something. So if you're doing a pattern and it says to repeat 6 more times, you do it once, and then you do it 6 more times. And if it says to do it 4 times, then you're only supposed to do it 4 times. So this thing, I accidentally knit, when I was doing the pattern, I accidentally used the wrong kind of yarn. I used worsted weight when I was supposed to use baby weight. And I accidentally didn't pay attention to the pattern since I read it wrong, and it was like, and it came up, I read it wrong, and I thought I was supposed to repeat it 4 more times, but it only said repeat 4 times in total. So this ended up way taller than it was supposed to. And then this one, I used the right weight yarn, and this one, so this one, this one I remade, and I used the right weight yarn, yarn and stuff, and it ended up like the right amount of stitches, and so I redid it, and I just did it correctly, and I just watched the video and followed the pattern correctly, so then I understood what was going on. So yeah, sometimes even though I'm not an expert, even though I've been knitting for years, I still make a bunch of mistakes when it comes to knitting. Just so you guys know, I'm not a complete knitting expert. I still make mistakes too. Number 6 on my list would have to be, keep a loose tension. So one of the hardest things I've noticed for beginners is how they knit too tight. Don't knit too tight, because you're going to have a hard time getting your needle into your stitch and stuff. And trust me, I've been there, done that, never want to go back. And it is super hard to keep, it is pretty hard to keep your tension loose. Because like you get you're trying to get your yarn comfortable, and when you're getting your yarn super comfortable, you accidentally hold it too tight that it either burns your fingers. Trust me, it really hurts. I've gotten yarn burns from fingers before. They're not too bad, but it just burns your fingers a little bit. So when you like tug on it, you got to make sure you're not holding your yarn too tight that you tug on it so tight. So my tip is probably just keep your tension loose enough, but not too loose, so then you so that your yarn's not hanging out everywhere. It's just keep it loose and comfortable for your hands and stuff like that, because like the looser your tension, the better your stitches will be, but the tighter your tension, the harder your stitches will be to knit. Number 8 on my list would have to be pay attention to how many skeins that you need of yarn that you need. So this is one thing I kind of forget to do too, is like I'm knitting a beach bag right now, and my last beach bag took me about like 3 skeins of yarn when it was only supposed to do when it actually took me about 3. So I had to order extra yarn just in case so I ordered extra just because I wasn't sure how many skeins it would take and stuff. So I ordered like 2 skeins only by mistake when it actually was, but when it didn't say. Okay, so anyway, I'm trying to explain this as best I can. So I ordered only 2 skeins of yarn one time when I was making a beach bag, but it was less yarn. It wasn't enough yarn for the project, so I had to order extra. So I ordered 2 extra skeins just to be safe, and I ordered the 2 extra skeins, and I ended up using only 3 for this project. So it took me about 3 skeins of yarn instead of like 2. So the important thing is, like, if you're knitting a certain project, it's important to pay attention to how many skeins of yarn that is needed and stuff, because like if you make a scarf and your scarf is supposed to only use 2 skeins and you only bought 1, be sure to buy it ahead of time, so then you know like how many skeins is needed for your project. Like it'll usually say in the what's it called? The materials needed that you will have to buy this many skeins of yarn for this project. It'll say you need 3 or 4 balls of yarn depending on like what project you're knitting and stuff. So the important thing is just make sure you pay close attention, or I think it does it in grams, but if you're not very good with like grams, which is not my thing, I would probably just go by skeins, because it makes it much easier for me, because math is not my best subject. Most of you probably know that since I've mentioned it many times. Number 9 on my list would have to be look at the yarn label to see what needle size is recommended. So let me show you guys an example. So I have a skein of Red Heart yarn right here. And if you look right here, it has like a label. I don't know if you can read that very well. It suggests what needle size is recommended for your yarn. Like this right here, it has my it has the knitting needles and stuff. And I think in England they go by millimeters, but if you're in the US, it goes by size 8. So this is what the size is recommended for your right here. So if you guys live in Europe or UK, you go by 5 millimeters, but in the US you just go by size 8. So it'll say right here, it has a picture of the knitting needles, and it'll say what size is recommended right at the bottom for the US. And for my UK subscribers, it goes by millimeters. I'm sure you guys all understand that. And it's the same for crocheting as well. It'll say what size hook is recommended and stuff. Sorry. Number 10 on my list will have to be keep your ends long enough to weave in. So when you're knitting, don't leave like a really tiny short tail, because that's not enough to weave in. You can either leave it like long enough to like sew it in, or I usually just leave about like a 6 to 5 inch tail for weaving in with my crochet hook, because then I don't have so much to weave in. I personally just do it that way because I was taught to weave in with a crochet hook over a darning needle or a tapestry needle. But if you guys like to use tapestry needles, that's completely fine. We're all different. I was just taught to use a crochet hook when it came to knitting to weave in my ends. So just make sure so when you are knitting, make sure you don't leave too short of a tail. Been there, done that, never want to go back, and I did not have enough to weave in, and my whole project almost unraveled. So it's important to weave in, to make sure you have enough tail to weave in, so then your project doesn't unravel. Okay, so those are my top 10 knitting tips. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching. Please do like and subscribe if you haven't already. I post Monday through Saturday, and I'll see you in another video soon. Bye!